Garry Kasparov is considered one of the best players of all time, but what makes him a bit more interesting is he had a more of a dynamic attacking style of chess compared to the more positional players of his time like Karpov, Botvinnik and Tigran Petrosian. Today I'll be showing you an absolute positional and endgame clinic by Kasparov from a game he played in his youth. So we have Garry Kasparov versus Oleg Vasilchenko, and Kasparov begins with e4, so good to see that instead of this super positional d4 stuff. And then we see e6, this is the French defense. So classic line here, we're into the French. Of course, as white, if you can put 2 pawns in the center, you definitely should. And then we see knight d2. This is called the Tarrasch variation of the French, and the idea is to discourage black from playing bishop b4, because in a lot of lines, if you have this knight on c3, bishop b4 can be a very annoying pinning of this knight, and they can take and maybe try and compromise your center. So if bishop b4 is ever played, you just have this move c3 and it kicks it away. And here there's a variety of moves black can play. Black can go knight f6, they can go c4, quick c4 is quite aggressive, maybe, and even knight c6. There's a lot of good options, these are all pretty solid approaches. After c5, there's a pretty interesting move here. You can go knight fg3, knight c6, this is the main line, e takes d5, e takes d5, bishop to b5, pins the knight, and of course stops black from quickly capturing here and exchanging. You see bishop to d7, castles, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, c takes d4, and then rook e1 check. And this move forces an ugly concession for black. Black actually has to play the move knight e7, because knight e7, well, it looks very ugly because you block your bishop, and you have to play knight e7 because if you try and block with the bishop, it looks a lot more natural because your knight can still come to f6, where you walk into a brutal move queen to g4, and of course the bishop can't take because it's pinned, and now you're threatening that g6 pawn. So if you try and play something like this, obviously you're going to lose your rook. So I was looking at with the engine, and the best move here is actually g6. g6 or g5 are both quite good, but you just walk into the same complications. So g6, queen takes d4, hitting the rook. f6 is forced because you can't block the knight because that bishop's pinned. Brutal stuff. And then queen takes d5. You're just down a clean pawn in the opening and positionally ruined because this structure is terrible. Like, which way you're going to castle? You've already played f6 and g6. And of course, there's not even any pawns here for you to long castle and be safe. So, bit of venom in the Tarrasch, especially if they miss the top theory moves like knight e7 earlier. So there's mistakes to be made. So we see knight c6 by his opponent, and now this blocks his c-pawn. So you don't really have to worry about your center getting crushed as quickly, but obviously instant pressure on this d4 pawn, so have to defend that. How are you going to do it? Develop a piece, knight f3, guard that pawn. And then knight to h6 is a very weird move. Now this looks like a beginner's mistake, but the idea here is to avoid playing knight f6, which just runs into an immediate e5 with tempo because obviously the knight is hit and we'll have to move back. So interesting move here, and obviously maybe it's getting Kasparov out of theory. I don't know if this is line at the time, I honestly couldn't tell you. But then we see e5 anyway by Kasparov. If he wants to attack on the king side, it's going to help him because it's much harder for black to get his pieces toward the king side. I mean, to defend himself, like this bishop's never going to get to the king side. This knight's going to have a lot of trouble. Maybe it's going to have to rotate like this, but again, a little bit of a slow maneuver. So we see f6 is a very common idea in the French defense. You know, fine goal to never play f6. Here it's actually fairly decent. Here it's actually a fairly decent move because you're trying to break. But the normal idea is you have this knight on g6, and knight will recapture the pawn, getting knight into the game. But here it's less clear who's going to take back. You know, is it the queen? Are you going to really compromise yourself with g6? Or maybe have the open file. That looks a bit suspicious. And also maybe you do this break after you already castled, and then of course you can take with the rook. So another interesting idea here from Oleg. So bishop to b5 played by Kasparov, just wants to maybe trade this bishop off if he can, and also he can now castle. So bishop to d7, of course, block that pin, takes, leaves black with this very unimpressive light square bishop. I mean, what is this bishop even doing? Looking at your own pawns. Now, it's a classic French bishop, known as the bishop that never gets out, and here, extremely unimpressive. And even this dark squared bishop, look at the scope of it. You can go here, but again, you're running into c3, so all you really have is bishop e7. So we see knight to b3, Kasparov jumps his knight into the game, maybe eyeing up that juicy c5 square. So knight to f7, yes, here we can see the justification of this move. So now after f6, he can go knight f7, and now it's putting a little bit of pressure on Kasparov's e5 pawn. He's starting to take, and if knight takes, he can take, or maybe have different moves like targeting it with the bishop, or breaking through with the rook or something. So Kasparov doesn't like the pressure there, decides to go quick bishop f4, and f5, completely closing the position, which is a bit of a weird move because positionally it just looks very odd. You don't really see this very often. We almost have this sort of like check variation Benoni type pawn structure, which I covered in my Feingold game, but it just shifted over one square because of course that's e5. So very, very close center. And from my personal perspective, it just seems like black has sort of closed the center and allowed white to attack, because all black's pieces aren't going to be very helpful. Like what you can do, get your queen out on this diagonal, like it's not going to help you very much. Because white's pieces, look, white's pieces, they can get to the king side very quickly. But black's pieces, as I mentioned before, they can't get to the king side very quickly. So, interesting move. h4 by Kasparov, quickly capitalizing. Bishop to e7, almost an only move. Maybe black's going to castle here. And then Kasparov, classic sort of positional move. Connect the rooks, ready to castle, queen to d2. So now we can castle both ways as well. So b6 played. Maybe going to get that bishop back, play for something like c5. Also just a proposed move like a5 if white decides to castle short, maybe begin an attack on the white position. So then c3, protects against c5 down the line, just solidifies Kasparov's center. Very classic move. Bishop b7, now we see into the sort of free and castle position, the bishop in this little hut, and it's very well protected now. You're not going to get to this let's go bishop, but again, what's it really looking at? I mean, Kasparov's not going to at his own will. Not at his own will is he going to break down his own pawn structure and let this bishop out. That'd be a positional blunder. So Kasparov, of course, doesn't do that. Instead, bishop e3, maybe playing f4, just wants to get his bishop out of the way of the attack that can rage, so he can just get his pawns up here. Queen to d7, knight to c1. I mean, this is brilliant from Kasparov. Now he says, as my arrows have outlined, he can go to e2, he can go to g3, and he's rotated all his pieces around to the king side. Black's king is going to get absolutely smoked if he tries to castle quickly now. And a sneaky move by Oleg here. Bishop to a6. Now you're thinking, why is he moving his bishop twice in 2 moves? Well, this is actually the best move according to the engine. It does prevent white from castling short, but that's not the idea. The idea is, if this knight comes to e2, he can quickly trade that off, and then white's going to have less pieces to attack black's king, and this French bishop is finally been dealt with. He's managed to trade that off, so good play from Vasilchenko here. Rook h3 by Kasparov, maybe trying to go to the g file, maybe trying to double up on that file later in the game. That's a very long-term move. Queen b5, now threatening mate in 1 if that wasn't defended, obviously not going to be mate in 1, but now if the knight comes in, which it does, so we see knight e2, you can actually take with the queen. Now this is not a sacrifice, just a trade, because obviously the king can't take and you can't take like that, so queen takes, and then bishop takes, and then king takes bishop. So now white cannot castle, so Oleg's probably quite happy here, and he's traded off that knight, which could become a bit of a problem on g3, rotating into the game, attacking that weak pawn on g7, so Vasilchenko will be happy here. But as we can see, white's centre is extremely strong here. He has this connect 4 on the king side, and then black's got a dot square bishop, and so does white, to be fair. But I'd take this one over this one any day. That one's just kind of passively defending, but Kasparov is trying to create problems and attack this weak pawn here. I mean, we can say black isn't going to get checkmated here anymore, because the queens are off the board. But white is just clearly better with more space and activity, so we'll see how this plays out. Long castles by Vasilchenko. This is actually a bit of a mistake. It's a human move, but it's a bit of a mistake according to the engine. Since it misses the main asset of black's position. As if we go back and move, we can see that the best thing black can do here is actually play c5. So here we play c5, quickly striking back in the center, trying to crack this central dam white has created. Black will actually stand better, because if white decides to capture after bc5, then black actually stands better here due to his very annoying pressure down the b file. So another interesting variation. In the game, knight g5 was played by Kasparov, maybe trying to exchange the knights, and then he's going to have very nagging pressure on the h file, because he can easily just double his rooks to this useful rook h3 move. So we have knight takes g5, pawn takes g5, and then rook fd8, played by Vasilchenko, maybe trying to play f4, but it's not a great square for the rook, because it kind of looks like you're threatening rook f4 with the eye test, but Kasparov easily refutes this, playing g3. Now that square is controlled. What is this rook really doing? It's no longer helping support the c-pawns because the king is in the way. Vasilchenko's position doesn't really make much sense at this point. But he does find a great move here. He plays g6. You think, wait, what is that? Looks like a complete waste of time. What is this guy doing? Well, the idea is that this pawn is very, very weak. You can all see this. This pawn is only defended by one piece of the rook, and Kasparov's going to double his rooks really quickly. And the idea of this g7 move is, now that pawn's out of the way, you can defend this pawn with both rooks. So, quite clever. We see rook h6 by Kasparov, just really getting in there, making sure his pawns don't move forward when he's trying to attack them. Rook to f7, defending the pawn. Rook ah1, doubling up on the longest file on the board, obviously closed position. Each side actually has 8 pawns. But this file is probably going to be open soon, and with black's rooks both tied down here, Kasparov is free to use the rest of his pieces to try and get some play. So we see rook g7, king f3, king d7, g4, finally Kasparov breaks in the position, fg4, king takes g4, and then king e8. Now both the kings have been waddling up the board, but as you can see Kasparov's king is already more into the action. Look at how passive black is here. And then b4, Kasparov has baited the king over to the king side, and now he's striking on the queen side. a6, trying to prevent from the expansion from happening. a4, Kasparov really needs a breakthrough here. King d7, the king is forced to go back to the queen side to address the situation with the pawns. And then just b5. a5, closing it down. And c4. Kasparov's going to sacrifice the pawn to try and finally get a breakthrough. Vasilchenko obliges, takes a sacrifice. Now the race is on. Can he stop this pawn? And what is Kasparov's real plan here? So you see rook to c1, stopping that pawn. He can leave the pressure on h-pawn for now, because if black decides to get lazy and do something like this, and then rotate the rook over, he'll easily be able to swing back and win that pawn. So rook to e8 played by Vasilchenko. Rook takes c4, recapturing the pawn. Bishop d8, freeing up his rooks a bit more. Kasparov decides to get his king in the game. Rook e7, doubling up on defending that pawn. And then king e4. Kasparov has completely centralized his king. Now he's prepared to attack. And you can see his pawns just stand better. Now these pawns are all passive. There's a target there, target there. Where are the targets in Kasparov's position? There isn't. Every single piece and pawn in Kasparov's position is defended. I mean, obviously, Vasilchenko has that as well, but these are just targets. These two pawns are so weak. A little bit of shuffling with the rooks, and then d5. Finally on the board. Kasparov picks his moment. Finally, it's time to break through. Captured. King takes d5, and now Kasparov's king is really in the game. I mean, look at the expansion. Look at all the space White has here. White is controlling all of this. Black is just getting hemmed in into this tiny box. Rook e8 played. e6 check. I mean, Vasilchenko does not have very many moves. King c8 and a great move from Kasparov here. This pawn is weak. How do you make it weaker? Bishop d4. Hits the rook. Rook has to move. And as you may see already, if the rook goes back, you lose the pawn immediately, right? But if you try and go to f7, you just walk into bishop g6, and then the rook can't go to any e-square, it's controlled by the pawn. So that rook is actually trapped, and you're going to have to relinquish control of this h7 square. Well, actually, you're going to lose your rook as well, because maybe, okay, no, you're going to have to step forwards in here and trade the rooks and then lose this pawn. So it's a very uncomfortable position for black. So we see rook g to g8, has to move back, has to relinquish control of that pawn, because obviously allowing bishop to f7 with tempo is just not something black wants to see. So after rook takes h7, Vasilchenko resigned the game because look at all his pieces. He has nothing to play for. All he's going to have to do is shuffle these rooks around and let Kasparov win the game. A positional masterclass from Kasparov in the French. So if you enjoyed that video, should be a video popping up now that YouTube thinks you're going to like as well. So probably good to give that one a watch. Maybe comment any really interesting games you'd like to see next. And hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one.